Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place that sits between everything and belongs to nothing, not the warp, with its churning madness and its four great architects of ruin, pressing their ancient, terrible faces against the walls of reality, like children pressing against a shop window. Hungry, wanting, always wanting. Not real space either, with its cold stars and its burning wars, and the 10,000 individual ways a person can die before they've had time to finish a morning prayer. Something else. Something older. Something that predates the Elder, predates the Necrons, predates every civilization that has risen and fallen in this galaxy's long and miserable history. The Elder call it the Labyrinth Dimension, which is already a name that should give you pause. Not the safe dimension, not the transit network, the labyrinth dimension. These are people who built their entire civilization around this structure and chose to name it after a mythological construct specifically designed to trap and kill whoever enters it. The fact that they chose that name should tell you something about their relationship with the thing they call home. Imperial scholars who have survived long enough to file a coherent report call it the Webway, which is somewhat more neutral. Most Imperial scholars do not survive long enough to file coherent reports about it, which tells you something else. And somewhere deep inside the Webway, past the lit corridors that the craft worlds use for regular transit, past the routes that harlequins dance along with terrifying ease, and past the port cities and the hidden fortresses and the sealed gates with runes burned so deeply into the walls that the stone itself seems to carry the emotional weight of whatever put them there. There is a region that even the Aeldari, who built the thing and have maintained what's left of it for 10,000 years, refuse to discuss in anything but hushed voices. The deep Webway, the sections that nobody mapped any longer, if they were ever mapped at all. The corridors that were closed off after the fall, sealed behind barriers of condensed psychic energy and carved warnings in a language that predates even the height of the Eldari Empire. Gates that haven't opened in 10,000 years. Passages where the walls have grown things that have no name in any language spoken by the living. Sections where time doesn't flow the way it should, where it flows backward or fast or slow or not at all. Chambers where the boundary between the Webway and the warp has grown so thin that what presses against the other side can reach through with relatively little effort, and does so, regularly, hungrily. Things go in, very few things that were once people come back out. Tonight, we are going to talk about why. We are going to take the whole subject apart, the history of the Webway, the nature of the damage done to it, the specific categories of things that inhabit its deep sections, and why they are all individually capable of ending you, and the way all of these dangers compound on each other to create an environment that makes even the open warp look like a reasonable risk in comparison. The warp, at least, is consistently dangerous. Its rules are terrible, but they are learnable. Skilled navigators, trained astropaths, properly warded ships. These are all genuine defenses against the warp that have been refined over 10,000 years. The deep Webway is dangerous in a way that resists learning because the specific nature of the danger shifts depending on which section you're in, whether the temporal conditions are currently stable, which of the various categories of entity that inhabits a given passage have been recently active, and whether the particular combination of warp bleed, architectural degradation, and accumulated psychic corruption in your immediate vicinity is at a low enough level to allow coherent thought. The deep Webway is not simply dangerous. It is comprehensively, systematically layered in its lethality, and it is a place that has had millions of years to develop new ways to kill things, and it has not wasted the time. Settle in. Let's go through this properly. Part 1. The Old Ones and what they actually built. To understand what the deep Webway is now, you have to start with what the Webway was supposed to be, and to understand that, you have to go back. Not just a few thousand years, though the history of the past 10,000 years is horrifying enough on its own. You have to go back 65 million years, roughly, to a time when humanity was somewhere between hominid and early primate, barely out of the trees on a small planet near the middle of the galactic disk. A time when the galaxy looked almost nothing like it does today, in terms of which civilizations occupied which spaces, and almost exactly like today, in terms of the baseline nature of the warp, because the warp has always been there, and it has always been hungry. The old ones were the first. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know exactly what they looked like, though some interpretations of Aeldari legend suggest a reptilian or amphibian biology. Cold-blooded, slow, patient, in the way that only something that has truly mastered the long view of time can be patient. Their technology was so advanced that even the most sophisticated remnants of it, still functioning in the 41st millennium after 65 million years of operation without maintenance, are beyond the ability of the Adeptus Mechanicus to fully reverse engineer. They seeded worlds with life the way a farmer seeds fields, systematically, deliberately, with a clear vision of what they wanted to grow. They guided the development of intelligent species across the galaxy, shaping evolution with the careful hand of experienced cultivators. And they built the Webway. The scale of this is worth sitting with, because it's easy to describe the Webway as a big tunnel network and miss how extraordinary it actually is as an engineering achievement. The Webway is not a tunnel network in any conventional sense. It is not a series of physical passages carved through space. It is a constructed hyperdimensional space, an environment partitioned off from the Imperium itself, existing in the gap between the material universe and the roiling chaos of the warp, neither truly in real space, nor truly in the warp, but somewhere between them. Walled off from the worst of both by materials and mechanisms that the old ones understood at a fundamental level, and that no species since has been able to fully replicate. Think about what this means in practical terms. To travel between star systems without the Webway, you have options, and none of them are good. You can use generation ships and accept that your civilization is defined by journeys measured in millennia. You can use warp travel and accept the constant, terrifying risk of everything that lives in the Imperium taking an interest in you. The Necrons, when they had no alternative, used inertialess drive technology that was genuinely impressive, but still required physical transit through real space at speeds that made any form of coherent interstellar civilization logistically nightmarish. Yet the Webway removed the problem entirely. Step through a gate on one world, walk through a corridor that might take hours or days depending on the distance, and step out onto another world. No warp transit, no exposure to demons or the unpredictable tides of the Imperium. No time lost to the capricious way the warp eats years and centuries. Just a walk through a hallway that happens to bridge what would otherwise be thousands of light years of empty and hostile space. At its height, the Webway was everywhere. The old ones had linked worlds across the galaxy. The arteries, the largest passages, were immense enough that Aeldari warfleets could sail through them side by side without their hulls coming anywhere near the walls. The capillaries and smaller passages were scaled for infantry, for individuals, for the kind of movement that happens in peacetime when what you need is a person, not an army, to appear somewhere. And the whole vast system was maintained automatically, its ancient mechanisms whose precise nature is still not fully understood, keeping the walls stable, the psychic wards charged, the passages free of the intrusion that the warp would otherwise make the moment it noticed a gap in the barrier. The strategic implications of this were total. When the old ones were at war with the Necrontyre, the desperate, bitter, short-lived species that would eventually give themselves to the Catan and become the Necrons, the Webway made the conflict almost not a contest. The Necrontyre had technology and numbers, and a capacity for fury that even the old ones respected. They did not have the Webway. As the old ones could vanish from one theatre of the conflict and reappear in another, thousands of light years away, before the Necrontyre could even receive news that they'd left. They could reinforce any position instantly. They could withdraw from any position without the Necrontyre being able to press the advantage. The Necrontyre spent decades trying to pin down an enemy that was literally impossible to corner, because wherever you cornered them, they simply weren't there anymore. The Webway also had properties that went beyond the purely spatial. The Harlequins, who know more about the Webway than anyone except possibly Tegarak himself, who is rumored to know every single path, have spoken in guarded terms about the way the Webway interacts with time. The Old Ones, it is theorized, is understood that the Webway's position between real space and the warp gave it properties related to time's passage that went beyond the mild temporal relativism that warp travel produces. They chose, according to Harlequin accounts, not to exploit these properties, not out of ignorance, but out of caution. They knew what was there. They looked at it, and they decided that some doors were better left unopened. That level of caution, from a species that had mastered the manipulation of alternate dimensions and the construction of hyperdimensional infrastructure that still functions 65 million years later, should be noted carefully. When the most advanced civilization in galactic history looks at something and says, "No, not that one. We'll leave that alone," that thing is not to be trifled with. Yet the Webway was the greatest practical achievement of the greatest civilization the galaxy has ever produced. And then things started going wrong with it, one catastrophe at a time, in ways that accumulated instead of cancelling out, until what was once the safest highway in the universe became something else entirely. Part 2. The War in Heaven and the First Breach. The course of the War in Heaven is one of the best documented ancient conflicts in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, which is a strange thing to say given that it happened 65 million years ago, and is documented primarily through Aeldari myth and the racial memories of species that weren't there in the first place. But the broad outlines are clear enough to trace. The Necrontyre were dying on their homeworld near the Halo stars, on the outer fringe of the galaxy, back in a solar system, whose star bathed them in radiation that shortened their lives to decades and filled those decades with constant pain. They were technologically sophisticated enough to reach out to other systems, but not to solve the basic problem of their existence. And when they discovered that the Old Ones, who had been watching their development with the cautious interest of a gardener who isn't yet sure whether this particular plant is going to grow into something useful, were effectively immortal, the Necrontyre response was not admiration. It was fury. They asked the Old Ones for the secret of their longevity. The Old Ones declined, citing concerns about what an immortal Necrontyre civilization would look like, given what a mortal one was already doing to itself. The Necrontyre went to war. For a long time, this was not a meaningful war. The Necrontyre had technology. They did not have the Webway. The Old Ones vanished and reappeared at will, never offering a sustained target, never committing to a battle they hadn't already decided to win. The Necrontyre's war effort was the military equivalent of trying to punch a fog. Painful, exhausting, futile. Eventually, the Old Ones pushed them back to their irradiated homeworld and stopped engaging with them, which was both practical and, in retrospect, catastrophically unwise, because it meant the Necrontyre had time to fester. What they found in that time, studying the stars from their dying homeworld, were the Satan, ancient entities of pure energy, sometimes called star vampires in the technical sense, beings that had been present since the universe's earliest moments, feeding on stellar plasma, slowly developing something that passed for consciousness over billions of years. The Satan were not evil in any human sense of the word. They didn't have morality, they had hunger, and they had patience, and they had a capacity for strategic thought that had been developing for longer than most sapient species have existed. The Necrontyre offered the Satan physical forms, bodies of living metal that could contain their vast energies in a way that allowed them to interact with the material world more directly. The Satan accepted, and then, to repay the Necrontyre for this gift, they helped them do what they had always wanted to do. They helped them transform. Yet the process of biotransference, stripping the Necrontyre's consciousness out of biological bodies and uploading them into metal frames, was pitched as the solution to the mortality that had tortured the species for its entire existence. What the Satan did not mention was that the process would also strip out the soul. The Necrontyr who went through biotransference became the Necrons, immortal, indestructible, incapable of suffering the biological death that had defined their existence. They also became, in some fundamental way, diminished. The fire of genuine sapience, the emotional complexity that gave life meaning, much of that was lost in the transfer, and what the Satan didn't mention was that all of those stripped souls went directly to them as food. The Necrons won their war against death, and they paid for it with everything that made them who they were. And with the Satan backing them, the war turned. The Necrons were now essentially unkillable. Destroy a unit, and it simply rebuilt itself from the surrounding material. The Satan consumed stars, destabilized systems, hunted the old ones with a focused malevolence that the war had previously lacked. And then, in the closing stages of the war in heaven, they did the thing that cracked the foundation of the Webway forever. Niadrazatha, the Burning One, a Catan whose hunger expressed itself as an obsession with fire and entry, who had spent ages studying the exterior of the Webway and wanting to bring his eldritch fire inside it, showed the Necrons how to breach its walls. The resulting constructions were called dolmen gates, living stone portals that could punch a hole in the Webway's outer barrier, forcing entry into the interior of the network without the natural, psychically harmonious connection that the Old Ones and eventually the Eldari used to enter it properly. The dolmen gates worked. The Necrons poured into the Webway, and the entire strategic picture of the war in heaven shifted in an instant. The sanctuary that the Old Ones had retreated to, the network through which they moved freely and safely, was no longer safe. Their enemy was inside it. Here is something important about the dolmen gates that has to be understood clearly, because it explains why their legacy is still actively damaging the Webway in the 41st millennium. The dolmen gates did not open the Webway the way a proper gate opens it. They did not create a harmonious connection between the portal and the network. They forced a breach. They tore a hole. And the Webway, in some fashion that suggests a degree of active responsiveness that makes it difficult to think of as a purely passive structure, detected these breaches and attempted to respond to them, sealing off the infected spur, attempting to isolate the damage the way a living organism attempts to contain an infection. The attempt to seal off each new breach created sealed sections of the Webway, passages that were no longer part of the functioning network, cut off behind emergency seals, containing whatever had been inside them when the seal was applied. When the war in heaven was being fought in the Webway's corridors, and the Old Ones were being hunted through the very passages they'd built. The things that were inside those passages when they were sealed were the casualties of a galactic war. Debris, destroyed constructions, dead things, and possibly, the Harlequins speak of this with unusual care, the echoes of what the Old Ones were trying to preserve when the seals went down. The Old Ones lost the war in heaven. The enslavers, psychic entities drawn to the warp by the emotional carnage of the conflict, consumed their psychically active warrior races from within. The Satan, finally weakened by the sustained assault of multiple species, were destroyed and shattered into thousands of imprisoned fragments by the Necrons, who had finally had enough of being tools. And then the Necrons went to sleep in their tombs. The Webway, scarred by war, as its walls punctured in dozens of places by dolmen gates, and the weaponry of the conflict, containing sealed sections whose interiors had not been examined since the emergency closures, still functioned, diminished, damaged, but functional. It waited. Part 3. The Fall of the Eldari and the Shattering. In the wake of the war in heaven, the Eldari inherited the galaxy. They hadn't asked for the responsibility. The Old Ones had created them as psychic warrior servants, made them capable of channeling the warp as a weapon against Satan, who were anathema to psychic energy, and then placed them in a galaxy that was in ruins from a war between beings of a scale that made even powerful Eldari feel small. But inherit it, they did. They rebuilt. They expanded. They mastered the Webway, taking what the old ones had left and building upon it, as pushing new passages into new sections, connecting worlds the old ones had never connected, developing a civilization so vast and so sophisticated that even 10,000 years after its collapse, its remnants are among the most technologically advanced things in the galaxy. The height of the Aeldari Empire is difficult to describe. There were no other species operating at their level. Humanity was primitive, scattered across worlds, building cities in metal and stone, developing feudal hierarchies and early industrial technologies, while the Aeldari moved between stars, without noticing that the journey had taken time. The Necrons were asleep. The Orcs existed as a scattered, disorganized presence, rather than the galaxy-spanning threat they would eventually become. The galaxy was the Aeldari's, and they knew it. For a very long time, things were good. Then they started being less good, and then they became catastrophic. The exact progression of the Aeldari Empire's moral collapse is something the Aeldari themselves find painful to discuss in detail, in the way that any civilization finds it painful to discuss the specifics of how it destroyed itself. What is known in broad terms is this: the Aeldari were psychically powerful to a degree that made every sensation more intense than it would be for a lesser species. Joy was more joyful. Pain was more painful. Emotion of every kind was amplified by the psychic attunement that was their defining characteristic. This was an incredible gift, and it became, over centuries of peace and prosperity, a vulnerability. When there are no external pressures, when your civilization is the most advanced in the galaxy and no threat exists that you cannot manage, the internal pressures become everything. And the internal pressure that the Aeldari's psychic sensitivity created was simple. Everything that feels good feels extraordinary, and more feels better. The excess cults that emerged in the later centuries of the Empire were not simply decadent. They were something that the Aeldari's specific nature made almost inevitable. A species capable of experiencing pleasure so intensely that the search for more intense pleasure becomes consuming, and then destructive, and then something that cannot be named without being complicit in it. The warp responds to emotion. This is not a metaphor. The Imperium is shaped by the collective psychic weight of every sapient being in the galaxy. And when a species of billions of intensely psychic beings gives itself over to excess on a civilization-wide scale, the warp responds to that. Something began forming in the Imperium, a presence growing stronger as the emotional intensity of the Aeldari's collective descent deepened, a nascent entity feeding on the psychic output of a species destroying itself in slow motion, growing more cohesive and more powerful with every passing decade. Some Aeldari saw it coming. The Exodites left early, fleeing to the outer edges of the galaxy to build simpler lives on remote worlds. The craft world. Aeldari left later, when the signs were clear enough that even those in denial could no longer maintain it, loading their populations onto vast ark ships and getting out, outwarding their souls behind spirit stones and the discipline of the path system, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the center of the Empire's corruption. The Drukhari, or rather the Proto-Drukhari, the Aeldari, who would eventually become the Drukhari, retreated into the Webway itself, into the port cities and private sub-realms they had carved out within the labyrinth, continuing exactly the behavior that was feeding the thing in the warp, but doing so in a place they believed was insulated from the consequences. They were wrong about the specifics of that belief, but they were right that being inside the Webway would protect them from the worst of what was coming. Slaanesh was born in what imperial chronology places in the late 29th or early 30th millennium. But the birth scream of a newly created chaos god is not a metaphor. It is a literal psychic event of galaxy-spanning proportions. The Imperium ruptures, reality tears. The accumulated psychic energy of 1 billion years of Aeldari excess explodes outward from the epicenter, and that epicenter is the heart of the Aeldari Empire, where the greatest concentration of psychically powerful beings has been feeding the nascent god for centuries. In the moment of Slaanesh's birth, Trillions of Aeldari souls were consumed, pulled out of their bodies, their spirit stones, their infinity circuits, everything, and devoured by the god whose existence they had spent centuries creating. The wound that this created in space became the Eye of Terror, not a metaphor either, a permanent massive warp rift, and consuming systems that had been living and inhabited moments before, transforming entire star systems into part of the Chaos realm. The Crone worlds, the ancient, beautiful core worlds of the Eldari Empire, fell inside it and were gone, and the Webway shattered. This is not quite right, but it's the closest that human language can get to what happened. The psychic backlash of Slanesh's birth struck the Webway's hyperspatial pathways with a force proportional to what generated it. The Webway is made of psychically charged material, sustained by psychic mechanisms, filled with the residual psychic imprint of the civilization that built it. When a god made of psychic energy explodes into existence, next to the thing it has inadvertently been feeding on for centuries, the shock is not gentle. Sections of the Webway ruptured. Passages that had been stable for millions of years cracked open like ice under sudden pressure. Through the cracks, the Imperium poured, not in a steady flow, in floods, chaotic and forceful, carrying everything the open warp contains into sections of the labyrinth that had never been exposed to it before. Some sections were overwhelmed instantly. Others were damaged but held, their psychic materials still strong enough to contain the breach at a limited scale. And the Drukhari, sheltering in their subrealms, found their refuge far less perfectly safe than they'd believed. The walls between the Webway and the warp thinned everywhere, and in some places ceased to exist entirely. The Aeldari who survived spent the next several thousand years trying to manage the consequences. Craft-world seers, at working in cooperation with each other across the vast distances between drifting ships, painstakingly sealed breaches, burned shut passages that were too far gone to recover, tried to route traffic around the worst damage. They sealed the most dangerous sections with runes of power, not just physical barriers, but psychic locks designed to keep whatever was inside those sections from getting out into the functioning parts of the network. The deep Webway was what remained of the sections they gave up on, the passages they couldn't fix, the chambers where the breach was so complete that sealing it was the only option, not repairing it. The places where what poured in through the damaged walls had been in there long enough to establish itself, to adapt, to become something that had an opinion about people entering its territory. Or the tunnels where the psychic architecture had been so thoroughly disrupted by the influx of warp energy that the geometry no longer made sense in the way geometry is supposed to make sense, where the rules of the Webway that the Eldari understood had been replaced by rules that combined the Webway's specific properties with the warp's specific chaos in combinations that had never been tested and produced results that had never been catalogued. The Eldari sealed the doors and carved warnings on them and moved on, because there was nothing else to do. The network they had was diminished but functional. The network that lay beyond those sealed doors was something else. Something they were choosing not to engage with, not because they didn't know it was there, but because engaging with it had a very consistent outcome that they didn't want. Part 4. The physical reality of the deep Webway. Architecture in ruins. If you want to understand why the deep Webway kills people, you need to understand what it physically is. Not just in the conceptual sense, it's a hyperdimensional labyrinth, but in the specific, immediate, visceral sense of what it looks like and how it behaves when you're inside it. The maintained sections of the Webway glow. That's the first thing most accounts mention. A luminescence that emanates from the walls themselves, soft and shifting, without a clear source. The psychically charged material of the Webway's construction emits light as a byproduct of the psychic processes that maintain it. And in functioning sections, this creates an environment that is actually quite beautiful by most accounts. Strange, certainly. Alien, in the specific way that something built by a species with a fundamentally different relationship to the universe will always feel alien, but navigable, coherent, something a person with training and proper equipment can move through. The deep webway does not glow, or rather, it sometimes glows, but the glow is wrong, an orange or red hue that suggests heat rather than the cool luminescence of proper function, or patches of bioluminescence that seem to originate from things growing on the walls rather than from the walls themselves. In some sections, there is no light at all. In others, the light appears to come from sources that move when you're not looking directly at them. Start with the geometry, because it is the first and most persistent source of danger. The webway's physical architecture is not Euclidean. This is true even of the maintained sections. The old ones built it in the space between dimensions, and the rules of three-dimensional Euclidean geometry that apply in real space have a looser hold there. In maintained sections, this manifests as passages that seem to curve in directions that a navigator with a compass couldn't quite account for. Junctions that take slightly longer to traverse than they should. A general sense of spatial wrongness that experienced Eldari travelers learn to normalize, and that humans find quietly disorienting. In the deep webway, where the warp bleed has had thousands or millions of years to interact with the webway's already strange geometry, the non-Euclidean properties become extreme. But there are passages that curve back on themselves without appearing to. That is, a traveler walking in what appears to be a straight line will eventually emerge behind where they started, without having experienced any sensation of turning. There are junctions where 5 corridors appear to meet, and all 5 appear to lead in the same direction. There are chambers that are, by any measurement that can be taken inside them, vastly larger than their exteriors would suggest. Not just somewhat larger, but impossibly, confrontationally larger, in the way that makes you question whether the measurements are wrong, or whether the chamber has a different relationship to spatial dimensions than the corridor you came through. And there are passages in the deep webway that go down, that descend, for distances that the passage's length doesn't account for. One mechanicum analysis, done during the brief period of the Emperor's Webway project when certain sections were being surveyed, concluded that a human walking in a straight line through one particular deep section would die of old age before reaching its end, if it had one. Gravity in the deep webway is, at best, a strong suggestion. In the maintained sections, the webway's psychic architecture maintains a consistent gravitational direction. Down is down, the walls are the walls, the ceiling is the ceiling. In the deep sections, gravity becomes locally defined. What this means in practice is that 2 travelers 20 meters apart in the same chamber might be experiencing different gravitational directions, but the walls might be the floor for one and the ceiling for the other. In sections where the warp bleed has been most severe, gravity may shift continuously, or may be absent entirely, or may be present but oriented in directions that have no relationship to any consistent frame of reference. For a traveler trying to navigate, this is not just disorienting, it is catastrophic. Navigation requires a consistent frame of reference. It requires knowing what direction you came from, what direction you're heading, and how those 2 things relate to each other and to your destination. The deep webway strips all of that away systematically, and what's left is a person who knows they need to go somewhere and has no reliable way to determine what any direction means. Then there are the dead ends. The Eldari sealed sections of the webway by creating barriers, psychic locks, reinforced with the carved runes that draw on the same principles as the craft world's wraithbone construction. From the outside, these seals are walls. From the inside of a sealed section, they are also walls, but walls with a specific quality that ordinary walls don't have. They are one way. A traveler who somehow finds themselves inside a sealed section, by entering through a weakened section of the wall, by following a route that predates the ceiling, by entering from a dolmen gate breach that the Eldari didn't know about, cannot exit through the seal the same way. The seal is designed to keep things in. It keeps them in from both directions. Oh, what this means for a navigator who has somehow entered a sealed section without realizing it is that when they find the sealed wall and recognize it for what it is too late. They are inside the sealed section. They have been since before they found the wall. The question is now not, how do I get past this barrier, but how long have I been in here and what else is in here with me? Some sealed sections are empty, or nearly so. The carnage that originally required their sealing has long since resolved itself. Whatever was inside is long dead, and what remains is simply an isolated pocket of damaged Webway architecture. These sections are still dangerous for the navigational and temporal reasons we're discussing, but they are survivable in the sense that nothing inside them is actively hunting the traveler. Others are not empty, and we'll come to that. Part 5. The things that make their home in the dark. Let's be very specific about the biological threats, because they are extensive, varied, and each individually capable of ending a traveler who doesn't know what they're dealing with. The Psyche are perhaps the most immediately horrifying, and they deserve to be described in full. They are insectoid in their basic morphology, something recognizable to human eyes as a very large wasp, somewhere between 2 and 3 meters in length, with the spindly proportions and the iridescent quality that the order Xenos Magos biologist texts use as distinguishing features. They are native to the Imperium, or possibly to the Webway itself. There is a scholarly argument about this that has not been conclusively resolved, partly because conclusive resolution would require field research that nobody survives long enough to complete. Their presence across dozens of different worlds throughout the galaxy is most easily explained by their ability to use the Webway for transit, which suggests a level of familiarity with its interior that implies a long residence. They are psychically sensitive, extremely so. A Psyche can detect the specific mental emanations of an active psyker through the walls of a Webway passage. Not just the strong, obvious emanations of someone deliberately using psychic powers, but the subtler baseline output of any psyker who has not taken active steps to suppress their presence. In the deep Webway, where there are no maintained psychic wards to mask or dampen those emanations, yet a psyker is essentially walking around with a signal flare visible to every Psyche within range. The reproductive strategy is the thing that makes them a category of their own in threat assessment. Female Psyche, when fertile and in the presence of an unshielded psychic mind, do not attack in any conventional sense. They project their eggs psychically, a targeted act of telekinesis so precise that the eggs, which are no larger than grains of sand, are placed directly into the host's neural tissue without breaking the skin. The host feels nothing, perhaps a mild pressure sensation, perhaps a very slight headache, no worse than mild dehydration. By the following morning, the eggs have hatched. The larvae are feeding. The feeding process is specific and systematic. Our Psyche larvae consume the host's brain tissue in a deliberate order, higher cognitive functions first. Abstract reasoning, long-term planning, complex social awareness. These go first, in the first hours after hatching. In the early stages, the host may not notice anything beyond an unusual difficulty concentrating. By midday, the loss is pronounced. The host is confused, struggling to remember context, finding complex tasks impossible. By afternoon, the pain has begun. Not from the larvae's feeding, which is technically painless, but from the inflammatory response and the simple fact of having substantial portions of your brain consumed while you're still using them. By evening of that first day, the host is in agony and no longer functional as a sapient being. The larvae pupate inside the skull by the end of the second day. By the morning of the third day, they emerge as adult Psyche, and whatever the host was is over. The entire cycle takes roughly 48 hours. A traveler infected at the beginning of day 1 will be dead before the end of day 2, with most of the subjectively experienced portion being acutely horrible. The subtlety of the initial infection, combined with the length of the incubation period, relative to how quickly the symptoms progress, means that by the time a companion notices something is wrong, it is far too late. Psyche infestations in the deep Webway are not rare isolated incidents. In sections where the psychic wards have failed, which is most sections of the deep Webway by definition, the Psychnuin have established nests. But they are territorial within their nesting areas and patrol them with the systematic attention of successful predators. Sections of the deep webway that were sealed after the fall because they were too dangerous for regular Aeldari transit may have had Psychnuin populations for thousands of years, multiple generations adapting to the specific conditions of their sealed environment, becoming more specialized and potentially more dangerous than their counterparts in the open Imperium. Then there are the demons. In the maintained webway, demons are an intruding threat. Things that press against the psychic barriers from outside, that find gaps in craft-world wards and squeeze through, that are generally fought and expelled back toward the warp. In the deep webway, in sections where the walls are thinned or gone, demons are residents. They have been there, in some cases, for thousands of years. Since the fall, since the warp poured through the cracks opened by Slanesh's birth. A demon that has been living in a specific section of the deep webway for 1,000 years is not the same as a freshly manifested daemon from the open Imperium. The environment has shaped it. The specific properties of the webway, its strange geometry, its partial insulation from the broader warp, the way it sits between dimensions, have influenced how the demon expresses itself. Demons that have been in the deep webway long enough have adapted to its geometry in a way that freshly manifested ones haven't. They know which passages loop back on themselves. They know which chambers have the peculiar gravitational properties. They know where the temporal anomalies are and whether those anomalies are useful to them or dangerous. A demon in its home territory in the deep webway is hunting from a position of perfect environmental knowledge against prey that has none. The specific type of demon matters for its capabilities. Bloodletters of Khorne are different from pink horrors of Tzeentch, are different from plague bearers of Nurgle, but the home advantage is common to all of them. They have had time to become experts on the specific death that their section of the deep webway offers. Beyond the demons that came in through the Fall's breach, there are entities that defy the standard demon categorizations entirely. Things that have no clear chaos affiliation, no obvious relationship to any of the four great powers, no features that correspond to anything in either Aeldari demonology or imperial categorization. Harlequin accounts of the deep webway describe phenomena that suggest entities so old and so specifically adapted to the webway's between-dimensional environment that they predate the Aeldari's relationship with the webway entirely, possibly dating to the War in Heaven, when the first breaches were opened and the first truly foreign things found their way inside. What might 60 million years of adaptation to a specific hyperdimensional environment produce? The question is not rhetorical. Something is in there. It has been in there longer than any human civilization has existed. It had time to become whatever it is now in an environment with no other apex predators, and a constant slow trickle of things that wandered in through gaps they didn't know existed. The Harlequins do not discuss these entities in any detail, which is itself informative. The Harlequins discuss almost everything, and they decline to discuss these. The Komorag accounts of wandering shadows that tear apart the unwary are the most concrete documentation available of at least one category of deep webway entity that is not a demon in any standard sense, and is not a Psychnuin, and is not anything else that has a name. The shadows move independently of light sources. They are aware of observers. They respond to being observed by accelerating toward the observer. They are not killed by conventional weapons.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second and just say this is genuinely one of my favorite pieces in 40k lore to sit with, because the Webway isn't just a scary location, it's a tragedy dressed up as a dungeon. Like, every time I read deeper into it, I come back to the same feeling. The old ones built something perfect. The Aeldari took it and made it even more magnificent, and then the galaxy just kept happening to it, one catastrophe at a time, until the safest road in the universe became the most dangerous place in it. What gets me specifically is that it's still there, the deep sections, the ancient tunnels, the mechanisms, running on their own for 65 million years. None of it was destroyed, it was just made unreachable. And I think that's more unsettling than if it had simply been blown up, because He means somewhere in there, behind all of those sealed doors and temporal anomalies and things with no names, the original thing still exists. The dream of what it was supposed to be is still physically present, just completely inaccessible. But anyways, let's get back to the video.
They are not affected by psychic attacks in any consistent way. They are not, as far as the Drukhari who have spent 10,000 years trying to understand them can determine, alive in any sense that biological frameworks can accommodate. They are simply there, and they kill. And no one who has been able to provide a first-hand account of encountering one has been in any condition to provide more than the most fragmentary description. Part 6. The Necron Breach. Old Wounds, New Damage. After the war in heaven and the Great Sleep, the Necrons awoke in the 41st millennium to find a galaxy that had changed enormously without them. The Eldari Empire that had been their great enemy was gone, not defeated by them, but self-destroyed, which was satisfying in principle, if also somewhat anticlimactic. The old ones were gone. The Satan were imprisoned in shards. The galaxy was full of new species, humans especially, who had somehow spread to thousands of worlds in the gap between the Necrons going to sleep and waking up, which is impressive for a species that had been barely sapient when the Necrontyr were already building starships. The Necrons had a problem. They had always had this problem, but the Great Sleep had not solved it. They could not travel through the warp. The process of biotransference had stripped them of the psychic potential they would need to safely navigate the Imperium. And without psychic navigation, the warp is simply a place where terrible things eat anything that enters. Without warp travel, the Necrons were limited to two options: inertialess drive technology that was genuinely impressive, but required physical transit through real space at speeds that made any large-scale interstellar campaign logistically painful, or the Dolmen Gates. The Dolmen Gates are the Necron method of forced Webway entry. They haven't changed much from the originals that Nia Drazatha taught the Necrons to build during the War in Heaven. Living stone portals that punch through the Webway's walls rather than harmonizing with its existing entrances. The breach they create is unstable from the moment of creation. The Webway detects it and begins attempting to seal it off, isolating the infected spur from the rest of the network in exactly the way it has always done when facing unauthorized entry. This means that a Necron force using a Dolmen Gate is on a timer from the moment they enter the Webway. The sealing process is not instantaneous. It takes time. In some cases, enough time for a well-organized force to transit to their destination and exit through another gate before the closure completes. In other cases, the sealing is faster, or the force is slower, or the destination gate is farther than anticipated, and the result is a Necron force trapped inside a closing section of the Webway. Necrons trapped in the Webway cannot die in the usual sense. They are machines. They don't need air or food or any biological sustenance. But they can be damaged by the things in the deep Webway that have had millions of years to develop methods of damaging things that would otherwise be essentially indestructible. And the sealing mechanism itself, the Webway's defensive response to the breach, is not gentle. It presses inward. It compresses. It attempts, with the force of whatever ancient mechanisms still operate in the structure, to close the wound. A Necron caught in the full force of the Webway's sealing response is experiencing something analogous to being slowly compressed by a structure that has more structural integrity than anything their own technology could produce. Eventually, even living metal has limits. The Eldari, who have spent millennia hunting down and destroying Dolmen Gates, regard each new confirmed gate with the same mix of fury and weariness that they bring to most threats to the Webway's integrity. The breaches create new damage. New sealed sections accumulate. Each forced entry by the Necrons is another insult to a structure that is already sufficiently insulted. Another section sealed off. Another area of the deep Webway expanded by whatever gets shut in. Part 7. The Emperor's Great Dream and Magnus's Great Mistake. By the time of the Great Crusade, humanity had spread to thousands of worlds and was in the process of being united under the Emperor's vision for the Imperium. The Emperor, who had been present in one form or another since the dawn of humanity, who had guided human development with a patience measured in tens of thousands of years, had a plan for what humanity should eventually become, and a specific technical approach to making that plan work. The plan required the Webway. The Emperor had understood, probably longer than any other being currently alive in the galaxy, what the relationship between humanity and the warp represented. Humanity's psychic potential was developing. The number of human psychers being born was increasing, and every human psycher was both a resource, capable of providing the warp-derived powers that made astropaths and navigators essential to the Imperium's function, and a liability, because every psyker was also a point at which the warp could reach through into the human species. Every unsanctioned psyker was a potential gateway for demonic possession. Every astropathic chorus was a signal flare visible to things in the Imperium that had appetites. The Emperor's solution, as we understand it from the fragments of his communications that have been preserved and decoded, was to remove humanity from the warp entirely. Thus, not to suppress human psychic development, that was happening regardless, and suppressing it would only make the eventual eruption worse, but to provide an alternative to the warp as the medium through which humanity traveled, communicated, and operated. If humanity had the Webway, it didn't need the warp for transit. If it didn't need the warp for transit, the foothold that chaos held over human civilization could be systematically reduced. Eventually, over the long centuries that this plan would require to unfold, humanity would evolve into a fully psychic species with a controlled, protected relationship to its own psychic potential, and chaos would lose its primary method of reaching into human civilization. This was the Emperor's secret project, worked on in the deep levels of the Imperial Palace on Terra, hidden from almost everyone in his inner circle. He had found or constructed a portal into the Webway under the palace. The Golden Throne was the device through which this connection was made and maintained. Unlike the natural Webway gates that the Aeldari used, which harmonized with the network's existing psychic architecture, the Emperor's gateway was not made of psychically resistant materials. His own psychic presence, vast enough that even the Chaos Gods acknowledged his power, was what held the human-constructed sections of the tunnel safe from the warp's intrusion. He was building new Webway tunnels, expanding the network with human-constructed sections, creating a human presence in the Webway that could eventually grow into something the Imperium could rely on. He had created a special caste of Mechanicum tech priests called the Unifiers to do the construction, and he had, at the point where the story goes wrong, been working on it for years while the Great Crusade proceeded under Horus's command. Magnus the Red was one of the Emperor's primarchs, the genetically engineered demigod generals created to lead the Space Marine legions. He was the primarch of the Thousand Suns, a legion defined by its relationship to psychic power. Magnus himself was possibly the second most powerful psyker in the galaxy at the time, exceeded only by the Emperor himself. He was brilliant, dedicated to the accumulation of knowledge, and, this is the part that matters, he had discovered through his sorcerous investigations that Horus was being corrupted. He tried to warn the Emperor. He knew the Emperor was deep in the Webway project, unreachable through normal means. He knew the Emperor had forbidden the use of certain psychic techniques in the Imperial Palace. He chose to use those techniques anyway, because the warning felt more important than the restriction. The psychic ritual Magnus used to force contact with the Emperor created a backlash that struck the wards protecting the Imperial Palace. The wards shattered. The Golden Throne's connection to the Webway, held stable by those wards, tore open, and through the breach poured demons, in numbers that began as dozens and escalated to millions as the Chaos powers recognized what had happened and immediately committed everything they could move to the opportunity. What the Emperor's response was to do the only thing that would prevent Terra from being overrun. He sat on the Golden Throne and put himself between the breach and the warp. His psychic presence, covering the gap, pressing against the flood of demonic force, was the only thing preventing the whole of the human Webway project from becoming a permanent channel through which the warp could pour directly into the Imperial Palace. He could not leave the throne and fight. He could not leave the throne and direct the Horus heresy. He could not, effectively, leave the throne at all, because the breach was not the kind of thing that would wait for him to come back. And into the Webway, he sent the Adeptus Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, his personal guard, and the pariah warriors, whose psychic null field made them the most effective anti-demon force available. They fought for 5 years in the tunnels of the Webway, defending the human-constructed sections, pushing back the demonic tide, trying to hold space for the Mechanicum workers to repair the damage and seal the rifts. The abandoned Aeldari city of Kalistar, the impossible city, so named because its architecture should have been impossible to construct within the Webway's dimensional constraints, but the Aeldari had found a way anyway, became the Imperial forces' center of operations. They fortified it and fought from it while the construction workers sealed what could be sealed behind them. The Chaos powers sent everything available. Greater demons, corrupted space marines who had joined Horus and been given access to the Webway through whatever methods Chaos had available. Titan war engines, massive walker vehicles originally designed for surface warfare, walking through Webway corridors whose walls cracked and buckled under the shockwaves of Titan weapons fire. Every section of the Webway that a Titan's cannon punched through was permanently lost, the damage too extensive and too fundamental for any repair. The Custodians and Sisters fought with everything they had. They held the corridors with weapons designed to fight demons in an environment where the warp was pressing in from every side, where the very walls were compromised enough that the Chaos entities assaulting them were drawing strength from local warp bleed. In every casualty on the Imperial side was a permanent loss. Every demon destroyed, simply reformed in the warp and attacked again. 5 years of this. The Custodians, the 10,000, were reduced by 90%. The Sisters suffered comparable losses. Kalistar fell to a sustained assault that included Chaos Titans. The Mechanicum forces broke and ran, their commander possessed by the demon sword Drakenyen and turned against the retreating Imperials. The surviving Custodians and Sisters were driven back to the gateway itself, defending the threshold with what was left of their strength. The Emperor left the throne for a single day. 1,000 Psykers were sacrificed to power it without him for that brief window. He plunged into the Webway and fought, burning golden, as summoning the psychic echoes of those who had died in loyal service, driving back the demonic host in a display of raw power that none of the surviving defenders had seen before and would never see again. He turned the tide. He pushed the demons back, and then he returned to the throne because he had to, because the breach still existed and it still needed to be held. The war within the Webway ended with the human sections largely destroyed. The Mechanicum's construction was too badly damaged to salvage. Too many tunnels were gone. The Emperor's dream of giving humanity the Webway died in those 5 years. What remained was the breach itself, still open, still requiring the Emperor's presence to hold it partially closed. That has been the situation for 10,000 years. The Emperor on the throne, the breach held but not sealed, and the Custodians standing guard. And beyond the gate, in the deep Webway where the war was fought, sections that were battlefields are now something else, haunted by the memory and by whatever took up residence in the aftermath. Part 8. Komarach. The dangers. Even the Drukhari fear. The Drukhari have lived in the Webway for 10,000 years. They are the species most adapted to its specific conditions, the ones who chose it as their home, and have spent the longest period learning how to survive it. Understanding the limits of Drukhari survival tells you something precise about how dangerous the environment actually is. Komarach exists in a series of subrealms within the Webway, pocket dimensions carved out of the labyrinth dimension space, connected to each other by portals and passages, are scattered across sections of the Webway that in real space terms would be thousands of light years apart. The Dark City is not a city in any conventional sense. It is more like a civilization distributed across its own private section of a hyperdimensional network. with the network between subrealms serving the same function as roads serve in a city, and with none of the subrealms obeying the physical laws of real space in any consistent way. The Drukhari are there because the Webway provides some protection from Slaanesh. The gods' hunger for Aeldari souls, souls that burn with the specific intensity of a psychically gifted species, presses through the Imperium in every direction. And outside the Webway, every moment of existence for an Aeldari is lived with the awareness that their soul is being slowly consumed. Inside the Webway, as with its insulation from the Imperium, this is reduced, not eliminated, never eliminated, but reduced. What the Drukhari discovered relatively quickly after the fall is that they could further reduce the pressure by feeding themselves, by taking the psychic pain energy generated when they inflict suffering on other sapient beings and using it to supplement their own souls. The soul energy they drain from their victims temporarily replaces what Slaanesh is continuously drawing out. This is why the Drukhari raid. This is why every civilization that has had the misfortune of being within reach of a Webway gate has stories of people disappearing into the dark. The Drukhari need this. Without it, they become increasingly hollow, their souls thinning, their connection to existence weakening, their bodies beginning to age in ways that Aeldari bodies otherwise don't. The raids bring slaves back to Komorrah. The slaves go into the arenas, or into the torture chambers, or into the service of archons and homunculi and succubi, who use them in ways that are difficult to describe without losing the thread of the discussion. The point is that everything that sustains the Drukhari in Komorrah requires a constant influx of suffering, and that requirement has shaped every aspect of their civilization. But the specific dangers of Komorrah and the surrounding Webway sections are worth cataloguing, because the Drukhari's survival in them is not a measure of safety, but of extraordinary adaptation. The disjunction is the most dramatic threat. When the boundary between the Webway and the warp fails catastrophically in a localized area, thus the result is a rapid, widespread demonic incursion with no warning and no clean perimeter, a disjunction spreads. The failure in one section puts stress on adjacent sections, and as those sections fail, the stress spreads further. In a severe disjunction, a substantial portion of Komorrah can be rapidly overwhelmed, with demonic forces appearing literally anywhere that the boundary has failed, rather than at a single point that defenders could concentrate against. The Drukhari's prohibition against psychic use within Komorrah is their primary method of disjunction prevention. Every act of psychic expression destabilizes the local Webway geometry in a small but cumulative way. In an environment that is already adjacent to the warp and already under Slaanesh's constant pressure, at small cumulative destabilizations add up to disjunctions. The ban is therefore enforced with extreme prejudice. Any Drukhari caught using psychic powers within the Dark City faces immediate death. No exceptions, no appeals. This is one of the only rules in Komorrah that the various factions enforce without exception or negotiation. In 999 M41, a catastrophic disjunction hit Komorrah when Ivrain was born, the harbinger of Iniad, the Eldari god of the dead, who stirred in the depths of whatever realm the collective Eldari dead have been accumulating for 10,000 years. The event that produced this disjunction was the partial awakening of a Chaos God-scale Eldari psychic entity within the walls of the Dark City, which, when you put it that way, should not surprise anyone who has been paying attention to how disjunctions work. Arcane's gate tore open. Daemonic forces poured through it in numbers that overwhelmed the immediate defenses. Asdrubal Vecht, who has survived as the supreme overlord of Komorrah for 10,000 years through a combination of political genius, anticipatory brutality, and willingness to sacrifice absolutely anything that needs to be sacrificed, was forced to sacrifice entire districts. He cut them off from the rest of the city, plunging them into sub-dimensions disconnected from the broader Dark City, taking their populations of Drukhari and slaves with them to contain the spread of the incursion. Entire city districts simply ceased to exist as parts of Komorrah and became sealed sections of the deep Webway, containing everything that had been inside them when they were cut off. But the wandering shadows are the threat that the Drukhari discuss with the most visible unease. These are entities. The word is being used carefully because demon doesn't quite fit and creature implies biology that may not apply, that move through Komorak's subrealms independently of light, independently of physical structure, tearing apart anything they encounter. They are not amenable to any of the diplomatic or contractual frameworks the Drukhari use with everything else. They are not interested in the psychic pain energy that sustains the Drukhari economy. They cannot be employed, allied with, or directed. They can only be avoided, and avoiding them requires intelligence networks that are themselves dangerous to maintain, providing early warning of where they currently are and what direction they appear to be moving. The mandrakes, who exist in a shadowed subrealm adjacent to and partly overlapping with Komora, are at least somewhat legible as entities. They have something like motivations, something like goals, something like a language. They are extremely dangerous and intensely alien, but they can be interacted with in carefully controlled circumstances by Drukhari who know what they're doing. The wandering shadows cannot. Nobody has successfully interacted with a wandering shadow and reported on the experience. All of this, the disjunctions, the demonic incursions, the wandering shadows, the mandrakes, the political violence of the Dark City itself, which kills Drukhari at a rate that would horrify any other civilization, but that Komora has calibrated to as baseline, exists within the Webway sections that the Drukhari actively maintain and have specifically adapted themselves to survive. The sections beyond Komorach, the deep Webway that the Drukhari haven't bothered to claim because they've done enough cost-benefit analysis to know it isn't worth it. Those are worse. Part 9. The Black Library. Going deeper still. The Black Library exists somewhere in the Webway that no map currently shows correctly. The paths to it shift. The location does not change. The library is fixed, physically, in its specific section of the Webway. But reaching it requires navigating through the labyrinth dimension, using routes that the labyrinth dimension does not make readily available. The library actively resists being found by those who haven't been invited. This is not a metaphor for strict door policies. The Webway passages that lead to the Black Library are, in some sense, deliberately occluded by the library's psychic architecture, hidden behind apparent dead ends, disguised as sections that a navigator's senses would categorize as sealed or collapsed. Segarash created it. The Laughing God, the sole survivor among the Aeldari gods of the Fall, who escaped Slanesh through the application of a trickster's first principles. You cannot consume something you cannot catch, and you cannot catch something you cannot see. Established the Black Library as the Aeldari's collective repository of what they know about chaos. Everything. Every piece of documentation, every first-hand account, every prophecy and analysis and tactical assessment, the specific psychic properties of each of the 4 great powers, their histories, their plans, as far as those can be discerned, their weaknesses, such as they are, the interactions between them, the entities that serve them, the artifacts associated with them. The Black Library is not just a library in the sense of a place where books are kept. It is a place where some of the most dangerous information in the galaxy is kept, in conditions designed specifically to prevent that information from being misused. The tomes within it are psychically sealed in ways that can only be undone by specifically authorized readers. Some of the more extreme texts are enclosed in containment systems that actively prevent their contents from being perceived by any mind that hasn't been prepared for what it's about to experience. Access is controlled by the Harlequins, who guard the approaches, and by the Guardian Scribes, who are described in Aeldari texts as themselves the most terrible of all perils in the Webway. A remarkable claim when you consider everything else in the Webway, and one that is made without elaboration, which is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of it. The Solitaires, the Harlequin subgroup who stand apart even from their own organization, whose role in the Dance Without End involves embodying Slanesh, and who therefore walk closer to the edge than anyone else in any Eldari institution, can come and go from the Black Library freely, without escort or authorization. This freedom is a measure of what has been invested in making them resistant to exactly the things inside it. For thousands of years, the Black Library resisted every attempt to breach it. Chaos forces have wanted access to it since its creation. The knowledge within is a weapon against chaos, and any weapon against chaos is a weapon that chaos very much wants to either claim or destroy. The Thousand Sons traitor, Legion in particular, under their sorcerer Primarch, Magnus the Red, and more directly, under their most accomplished sorcerer Ahriman, have made reaching the Black Library a multi-century obsession. And Ahriman, in 998 M41, came closer than anyone had ever managed before. He led a force of Thousand Sons through the Webway, fighting through Harlequin defenses and Craft World forces simultaneously, navigating toward the library through his extensive collected knowledge of the Webway's architecture and his formidable psychic capability. He reached the passage approaches to the library itself. He could see, apparently, the Black Library's structure, could perceive it through his sorcerer's senses, from within sight distance. The Harlequins stopped him. The battle in those passages was catastrophic, even by the standards of battles fought inside the Webway. Multiple major arteries of the Webway, passages that the Eldari had used for transit and maintained for thousands of years, were choked with the dead and too damaged for further use. Ahriman was driven back through massive casualties on both sides. The damage to the Webway from that battle is permanent. Those sections are gone. Whatever existed in that region of the labyrinth dimension that could be accessed through those arteries is now cut off, not by deliberate sealing, but by the destruction of the passages themselves. Ahriman didn't reach the library, but the attempt cost the Eldari something that cannot be replaced, and that reduction in the Webway's maintained network is permanent. And then the Great Rift opened. A section of the Black Library itself fell through into the warp, not just damaged, not just isolated, but consumed. Part of the most carefully guarded repository of chaos knowledge in the galaxy, protected for 10,000 years by the most skilled warriors that Eldari have. It is now in the possession of Slaanesh. What that means for what was in that section, and what Slaanesh can do with it, is something the Black Council is presumably thinking about with considerable alarm. Part 10. When time itself becomes the enemy. The Deep Webway's temporal properties are, in some ways, the most quietly devastating feature of the environment, because they are the hardest to detect before you've already been exposed to them, and because the consequences of exposure range from somewhat inconvenient to categorically outside the range of outcomes that living beings can meaningfully address. Time in the Webway is independent of time in real space. This is a known property of the maintained sections, as where it manifests as mild differences in perceived duration that experienced Eldari travelers have learned to compensate for. If you spend what feels like 3 hours walking through a Webway passage and emerge to find that 4 hours have passed in real space, that's noted, accounted for, and does not require any fundamental revision of your understanding of how time works. In the Deep Webway, the temporal independence becomes severe. Some sections have temporal compression. Time passes much faster in them than in real space. A traveler who enters such a section and spends what feels like a day inside it might emerge to find that weeks or months have passed outside. In the more extreme versions of this, the traveler might age noticeably during what they experience as a brief transit. And some sections have temporal dilation. Time passes much slower than in real space. A traveler in these sections might spend what feels like several days walking and emerge to find that mere hours have passed outside. Inquisitor Chevak's experience of spending decades in the Webway and emerging with centuries reversed from his biological age suggests he spent substantial time in exactly this kind of section, a region where the Webway's relationship to time was so dramatically slower than real space that his body's aging process slowed with it. But these are the comprehensible end of the temporal spectrum. At least they're variations on a theme, more or less time, faster or slower. The extreme cases are different in kind. Uigebealach is the location in the Webway where time flows backward. This is documented, not speculated about, and not described through metaphor, but documented in Harlequin texts that are about as close to objective recording as the Eldari produce. At Uyghur the causal sequence runs in reverse. Events that would be consequences in forward time are prerequisites in reverse time. A person experiencing this, if a person can experience reverse time in any coherent sense, would be moving from death toward birth, which is a trajectory that does not accommodate continued survival in any format recognizable as living. The route to Uyghur cannot be found by searching. It requires following a specific and precisely defined sequence of Webway passages, including specific points where the traveler must exit the Webway into real space and re-enter it before continuing. The sequence is documented in the Book of the Rana Dandra, an Eldari text of extraordinary age and sensitivity, and requires navigational tools that are effectively impossible to obtain through any normal channel. The greatest Harlequin seers, who know the Webway better than any living beings other than possibly Kegorak himself, have never been able to reach Uyghur through search and navigation. Only by following the exact documented route can it be found. Inquisitor Jack Draco reached it once. What happened to him there is described in accounts that have survived the millennia as something that might be called apotheosis. His soul achieved a state that removed it from the normal cycle of consumption by chaos and death and rebirth, and placing it in something that has no name in any language that wasn't invented specifically to describe it. He died. His soul did not go to the warp. It went somewhere else. This is presented as a positive outcome in context, which suggests the alternatives were sufficiently terrible. The crossroads of inertia is the location where time does not flow at all. Not slow, not stopped in the way a movie is paused, simply absent. Time, as a dimension, as a property of the environment, as the medium through which cause and effect operate, does not exist there. What does a living being experience in a place without time? Experience itself requires time. Perception, thought, sensation, all of these are processes that unfold across duration. Without duration, there is no process. Without process, there is no experience. There is, presumably, just a state. Whatever state the traveler was in when they entered persisted in a way that has no relationship to anything that could be called life or consciousness, or anything that any language has words for. Whether this state can be exited is unknown. Whether anything that exits it is still what entered it is unknown. The Harlequins know the answers to these questions. They have, as noted, chosen not to share them. The practical implication for a navigator in the deep Webway is this: you cannot detect these temporal anomalies from outside. There is no reliable early warning system. The psychic senses of an Eldari can provide some guidance in familiar sections of the Webway. Long-term familiarity with a specific section builds an intuitive sense of its properties. But in the deep Webway, which is by definition unfamiliar, as those senses are navigating blind. You enter a section and you discover what its temporal properties are by experiencing them. By the time you know you've entered a section where time runs backward, you've been in it long enough to experience that. And whether you can leave the way you came in, given that the direction you came from is now the direction toward the future, rather than the direction toward the past, is a question for philosophers who have not yet invented the relevant concepts. Part 11. The Great Rift makes it all worse. 10,000 years of Eldari effort produced a Webway that was damaged, but navigable, reduced from its ancient glory, dangerous in its deep sections in ways that required enormous respect and careful management, but functional as the backbone of Eldari civilization's survival, and stable enough that the deterioration of the network proceeded slowly enough to manage. Then the Cicatrix Maledictum tore the galaxy in half. The Great Rift, known by 1,000 names, the most evocative of which are probably the Mouth of Ruin and the Dethedian, emerged from a cascade of interconnected catastrophes at the end of the 41st millennium. Cadia fell. The Chaos Lord Abaddon the Despoiler destroyed the blackstone pylons that had suppressed warp activity in the Cadian Gate for 10,000 years. Magnus the Red's invasion of the Fenris system added fresh psychic violence to an Imperium already close to its breaking point. The birth of Ivrain and the partial awakening of Iniad added more. The sundering of Craftworld Bieltan, one of the Craftworlds, added still more. And something, accounts differ on the specifics. But multiple sources describe it simply as catastrophe in the Webway itself, contributed from within. The result was a rift in reality so vast that it split the Imperium's territory roughly in half. Running from the Eye of Terror in the galactic north across the width of the galaxy to the Hadex anomaly in the east, the Cicatrix Maledictum is a permanent wound through which the warp presses with constant, overwhelming force. Worlds on its edges experience temporal distortions, reality fluctuations, demonic incursions, and the specific hell of seeing the sky itself become wrong, lit by the sickly energies of the immaterium rather than starlight. For the Webway, the effect was devastating. Routes that had been stable for thousands of years simply ceased to function. How the shock waves of warp energy that accompanied the rift's opening propagated through the Webway, not in real space, where the speed of light applies, but through the Webway itself, where the rules of propagation are different. And sections that had been maintained carefully fell to conditions equivalent to the deep Webway essentially overnight. Old seals were stressed to breaking. New breaches opened. Things that had been in sealed sections for millennia found themselves with access to sections of the Webway they hadn't been able to reach since the sealing, and moved into them. The Eldari responded with unprecedented interfaction cooperation. Craftworld, Eldari, Drukhari, and Harlequins working together in ways that would have seemed impossible a century before. The urgency of the Webway's deterioration was sufficient to overcome 10,000 years of fractious separate development. Even the Drukhari, who had spent those 10,000 years specifically cultivating an image of caring about nothing beyond immediate Drukhari interests, committed resources to the effort, not out of altruism, but out of the recognition that if the Webway failed completely, Komorrah failed with it. And without Komorrah, the Drukhari species has nowhere to exist. The Black Library's partial fall into the warp happened after the Great Rift. A section of the library, the most carefully defended location in the Webway, the repository that the Eldari had successfully protected for 10,000 years, simply fell through as the warp pressure exceeded what the library's defenses could maintain in that section. As it is Slaanesh now, the knowledge in it is in the possession of a being whose hunger for Eldari souls has never diminished, and whose patience for waiting until the right moment to use any resource is effectively infinite. What the Great Rift has done to the deep Webway is something that can be inferred but not fully documented, because documenting it would require going into the deep Webway to assess conditions and reporting on what was found, which is precisely the problem we've been discussing for the past half hour. The inference, from what can be observed of the maintained Webway's condition, and from what the Harlequins have chosen to say on the subject, is grim. If the maintained sections have been severely affected, the deep sections, where there was nothing left to maintain, and where the conditions were already at the edge of survivability, have been transformed into something that the pre-rift deep Webway looks generous compared to. Part 12. Why Nobody Gets Out. The complete accounting. We have covered a lot of ground. Let's now be very precise about the compounding nature of the deep Webway's lethality, because each individual threat is severe, and the combination of them is something qualitatively different from severe. A traveler entering the deep Webway faces, first, the navigation problem. The geometry is non-Euclidean in ways that scale from strange to impossible. There are no reliable landmarks. The passages do not respect consistent spatial relationships. The dead ends are invisible until you're inside them. Us and Eldari, with psychic attunement to the Webway's specific architecture, has genuine advantages here. The structure speaks to them in a language their nervous system can partially pass. A human, a Tau, a Necron, using technological navigation systems, any non-Aeldari entity. These have essentially no advantage over random chance when navigating the deep webway. Random chance, in this context, means you are as likely to go deeper and closer to the most dangerous sections as you are to find a way out. And the geometry being what it is, you may believe you're moving toward an exit when you're actually moving further in. Layered on top of the navigation problem is the temporal uncertainty. The deep webway's sections have temporal properties that cannot be detected in advance and that are discovered only through experience. So walking into a temporally aberrant section does not feel different from walking into a temporally normal one, right up until the moment when the difference becomes apparent. At that point, the consequences depend on which specific anomaly is present, ranging from you've lost time and arrived later than expected, through you've gained time and arrived earlier than expected, through time is flowing backward here, and all your assumptions about cause and effect are currently wrong, to time is not present in this section, and you are experiencing whatever the absence of time produces in a living consciousness, which we are not going to describe. The navigation problem and the temporal uncertainty interact badly, as a traveler who has entered a temporally slow section may correctly identify their location in the webway's spatial structure and correctly plot a route out, but executing that route takes subjectively longer than expected, during which more real space-time passes, during which the conditions outside may change in ways that affect the exit they're navigating toward. A traveler who has entered a temporally fast section may navigate correctly by spatial measures, but age significantly in the process of executing their exit. And into this already extremely hostile environment, add the creatures. The Psychnuane, which detect psychers through walls and reproduce by planting eggs in brains on a 48-hour death clock that doesn't manifest obviously until hours in. A navigator who is a psyker, and psykers have significant advantages in navigating the webway, is also the entity most visible to Psychnuane. The capacity that makes them better at navigating makes them better targeted by the primary biological threat. This is not coincidence. The webway was built by a species with psychic abilities, and the things that have adapted to live in its deep sections have had a very long time to develop strategies specifically for hunting psychically active prey. The adapted demons, who know the geometry of their sections and have had eternity to develop hunting strategies appropriate to an environment where geometry can be weaponized. The unnamed entities of uncertain age and uncertain nature. The wandering shadows of the dark city's outer sections, on all of them in an environment where the traveler has no map, no reliable temporal reference, and no way to detect what's around the next corner until they're around it. Then there is the psychic corrosion. The deep webway, adjacent to the warp, and without the maintained psychic architecture that keeps the usable sections coherent, has a degrading effect on unprepared minds. Not dramatically, not immediately, slowly, a gradual softening of boundaries, between self and environment first, then between past and present, then between intention and action. People who spend extended time in the deep webway without psychic protection begin to lose the narrative thread of who they are. They remember having goals, but the goals become abstract. They remember having a destination, but the destination becomes a feeling rather than a place. They become, in a specific and deeply unfortunate sense, of the webway, part of its ambient population of lost and wandering things, before they die. The Harlequins have their masks and their roles and their Thales, the discipline of becoming their ritual character so completely that the character remains intact even when the individual self is under pressure. The character can navigate even when the person is compromised. But Harlequins don't go alone into the deep webway without reason, and they don't go without knowing their specific destination and their specific route. Even for them, the deep webway is not casual. For everyone else, for the unlucky, the reckless, the desperate, as the scholars who thought they understood what they were getting into, the compounding nature of the deep webway's dangers creates an environment where survival is not just unlikely, but close to architecturally impossible. The labyrinth's structure works against escape. The temporal properties work against planning. The biological threats work against the specific capabilities that would make navigation possible. The psychic corrosion works against the cognitive coherence required to respond effectively to anything. The deep webway is not simply dangerous. It is designed, not deliberately, not by any single conscious agency, but by the accumulated consequences of 65 million years of catastrophe, to prevent anything that enters it from leaving. The sealed sections trap. The temporal anomalies disorient. The creatures hunt. Yet the psychic environment erodes, and all of it compounds, layer on layer, in a structure that the people who built it did not design to kill, and that has become, through everything done to it since, as comprehensive a death sentence as any location in the galaxy can offer. Conclusion: the shape of what was lost. The thing that stays with me about all of this, beyond the specific horror of individual threats, is the tragedy of what the Webway represents. The old ones built something miraculous, a structure that made a galaxy traversable, that removed the worst dangers of interstellar travel. That could have served as the foundation for civilizations that lasted millions of years longer than any civilization has managed to last. The Aeldari inherited it, and built on it, and made it even more magnificent. And the Emperor of Mankind looked at what they had and saw, clearly and correctly, that if he could give it to humanity, it would change everything. Remove humanity's entanglement with chaos, protect the development of human psychic potential, provide the infrastructure for a genuinely sustainable civilization across a galactic scale. All of that potential, all of that possibility. Still there, in the deep webway, the old passages, the ancient architecture, the mechanisms the old ones built that have been running for 65 million years without maintenance and are still functioning in whatever sense is still possible for structures that have been through everything the webway has been through. Still there and unreachable. That's because the galaxy's history of catastrophe has filled the parts of it that nobody can reach anymore with every category of thing that kills. The Warhammer 40,000 setting is sometimes described as a setting defined by what has been lost. What humanity was at its height before the Age of Strife. What the Aeldari were before the fall. What the galaxy might have been if the war in heaven had ended differently. Or if Slaanesh had never been born. Or if Magnus the Red had chosen differently in the moment that changed everything. The deep webway is all of those losses concentrated in one place. The most beautiful thing the galaxy ever produced, made into the most dangerous place in it, by the accumulated weight of everything that has gone wrong. Nobody survives the deep webway. And in the 41st millennium, that is perhaps the most complete expression of the setting's essential truth. The things that were made to help are now the things most capable of killing, and the distance between what something was meant to be and what it has become is measured in civilizations. Thank you for coming with me this far into the dark. If you enjoyed the walk and want to keep exploring, and there is a lot more of this galaxy left to explore, please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments what you'd like to look at next. The webway goes a long way down, and we've barely scratched the surface of what's in there. Stay safe. Watch for the wandering shadows. And for everything that has ever mattered, do not go into unmapped corridors alone. Script for Q. On 40K, channel https://www.youtube.com/@QON40K. Addendum 1. The Impossible City, Kalistar and What Remains. We spoke briefly about Kalistar, the Impossible City, during the war within the Webway, but it deserves its own attention because it is one of the most vivid examples of what the deep Webway does to things that try to exist inside it. Kalistar was an ancient Aeldari city that had been built within the Webway itself, not at the entrance to a Webway gate, not adjacent to a portal, but literally inside the labyrinth dimension, constructed in a section large enough to accommodate an urban settlement. The name Impossible City was given to it by the Mechanicum workers and custodians who used it as their base during the war within the Webway, Maybe because Kalastar's architecture defied every principle of structural engineering they understood. Buildings that should have collapsed were stable. Towers that should have fallen inward due to impossible geometry were upright. Spaces inside structures were larger than the structure's external dimensions in ways that weren't subtle. Rooms that were manifestly, confrontationally, larger on the inside than out. The Aeldari had not built Kalastar according to any engineering principles that humans or Necrons or any species that works in three-dimensional Euclidean space would recognize. They had built it according to the principles of the Webway's own geometry, a non-Euclidean architecture designed for an environment where non-Euclidean geometry is the baseline. In its time, Kalastar had presumably been a marvel, even abandoned, ancient, drifting in the unoccupied section of the Webway where it sat between the Fall and the Horus Heresy. It retained enough structural integrity to serve as a fortress. What it also retained were the things that had moved in after the Aeldari left. The evacuation of Kalastar, whenever it happened, in the long period between the Fall and the Horus Heresy, had not been complete. Some things did not leave. Some things moved in after the city was abandoned, finding in its non-Euclidean architecture a home that suited them in ways that Euclidean structures would not. And some things came through whatever breaches the Fall had opened in the sections of Webway surrounding the city, and found Kalastar a convenient anchor point. The custodians and Sisters of Silence who used Kalastar as their fortress during the war within the Webway were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the demonic hordes pressing in from the warp-breached sections, and one against what was already there when they arrived, which was not the same kind of enemy, but was not nothing. The accounts from survivors of the war within the Webway describe Kalastar as a place where the sensation of being watched never went away, where sounds came from sealed rooms, where the non-Euclidean architecture occasionally made it impossible to find a room that should have been accessible from a given corridor, and where sometimes the impossibly large interior spaces contained things that the exterior size of the building clearly could not have sheltered. When Kalastar fell, when the Chaos Titans broke through and the Archimandrite's forces abandoned the custodians and the demonic hordes swept through, whatever had been cohabiting with the Imperial forces was swept up in the fall of the city. What emerged from that was something that Imperial records from the subsequent period describe only as a location to avoid, sealed off from the human-constructed Webway sections, and left to whatever it had become. Kalastar exists, presumably, somewhere in the deep Webway still. A non-Euclidean city, built by a people who understood the Webway at a fundamental level, abandoned twice over, fought through by a war that damaged the surrounding Webway sections, fallen to demonic assault, and then left alone, to develop into whatever 10,000 years of isolation in those conditions produces. And the things that lived there before the battle presumably still live there. The things that came through during the battle presumably stayed. The structural damage from Titan weapons fire presumably altered the non-Euclidean geometry in ways that even the Aeldari's original understanding of it would struggle to account for. Nobody has gone to look. The Harlequins, who know more about the Webway than anyone, have chosen not to go and look. The fact that they have chosen not to go and look is, as with so many things in this context, the most informative thing we can know about what's there. Addendum 2. The Webway and its relationship to the warp, a clarification. There is a common misconception about the Webway that's worth addressing. Just because understanding the correction is essential to understanding exactly why the deep Webway is what it is. The misconception is that the Webway is simply a safe version of the warp, a version of the Imperium that has been filtered or cleaned or made navigable. This is not accurate, and the inaccuracy matters. The Webway sits between the material universe and the warp. It does not sit inside the warp. It is not the warp with the serial numbers filed off. It is a genuinely separate environment, constructed to exist in the interstice between the two primary dimensions, maintained by psychic mechanisms that keep it distinct from both. It is not fully material. Real space physics do not apply there in the way they apply on a planet or in deep space. It is not fully immaterial. The warp's properties of psychic responsiveness and narrative unreality do not apply there in the way they apply in the open immaterium. What it is, more precisely, is a third thing. A constructed dimensional environment with its own properties that are a function of its position rather than simply an inheritance from either of its neighbors. The non-Euclidean geometry of the Webway is not the same as the non-Euclidean geometry of the warp. The warp's geometry is continuously changing, responsive to the collective emotion of sapient life, absolutely unreliable as a frame of reference. The Webway's geometry is fixed, wrong by real space standards, but consistently wrong in ways that an expert navigator can learn and account for. But the warp's temporal properties are determined by the emotional currents of the immaterium. The Webway's temporal properties are determined by the Webway's specific structure, fixed per section, unchanging, not responsive to who is inside them or what they're feeling. This distinction matters for understanding the deep Webway specifically. When people say the deep Webway has been contaminated by the warp or opened to the warp, they're describing a real thing. But the real thing is not that the deep Webway has become part of the warp. It is that the walls between the Webway and the warp have failed in those sections, and the result is an environment that has been permanently changed by warp influence without becoming fully warp. And the geometry is still the Webway's geometry, non-Euclidean, but fixed. But it has been distorted by the warp's influence in ways that change which of the Webway's properties apply. The temporal anomalies in the deep Webway are native to the Webway. They have simply been amplified and made extreme by the weakening of the barriers that held them in check. The things that live in the Webway after the warp's intrusion are genuinely different from open warp demons. A demon that manifests in the warp is fundamentally of the warp. It is made of the immaterium substance, shaped by its currents, subject to its rules. A demon that has been in the deep Webway for thousands of years has adapted to the Webway's specific environment. It is still a demon in origin, but it has been changed by its residence the way any predator is changed by long residence in a specific habitat. It has learned the non-Euclidean geometry. It has developed a relationship with the temporal properties of its specific section. It has become something that cannot fully function in the open warp anymore, because it has become calibrated to something that is neither warp nor real space. This is why even very capable psychers who are good at dealing with warp-based threats find the deep Webway specifically dangerous. The techniques that work against open warp demons, anchoring to the material universe through the psycher's physical body, drawing on the light of the Astronomicon as a reference point, using the warp's own currents against the entity attacking you, are calibrated for the warp. In the deep Webway, and yet the calibration is off. The psyker is in an environment that is neither real space nor warp, fighting entities that are adapted to that environment, using tools designed for one of the two primary dimensions that the environment deliberately sits between. Addendum 3. The known and unknown. What the Harlequins know and won't say. The Harlequins occupy a unique position in the galaxy's relationship to the Webway. They are its most knowledgeable living navigators, more knowledgeable than the craft world Aeldari, who use it regularly, because the craft world Aeldari's knowledge is institutional and maintained, while the Harlequins' knowledge is something more like innate. The Laughing God is said to know every path through the Webway. His disciples walk it without fear, appearing and disappearing at will, yet navigating its most dangerous sections with a confidence that other Aeldari find somewhere between awe-inspiring and deeply disturbing. This knowledge is not shared. The Harlequins have a consistent policy about what they tell other people about the deep Webway. Essentially, nothing specific. They will warn. They will indicate that a given section should not be entered. They will describe consequences in general terms. They will not provide maps. They will not describe what lives in specific sections, except in the most general terms, and only when the description serves a specific protective purpose. They will not explain the temporal properties of specific sections or how to identify them in advance. The reasons for this reticence are not entirely opaque. Some of it is strategic. The Webway is the Aeldari's primary navigational asset, as a knowledge of its specific properties is power. Sharing that knowledge with species who might use it to navigate sections of the Webway that the Aeldari would rather they didn't navigate is not in the Aeldari's interest. Some of it is safety. Certain information about the deep Webway, if acted on by an inexperienced or ill-equipped party, is more dangerous than ignorance. Knowing that Uiga Bealach exists, and knowing how to get there without knowing how to survive getting there, is worse than not knowing it exists. But some of the reticence seems different in character. When Harlequins discuss certain sections of the deep Webway, the quality of their silence shifts. It is not the silence of someone withholding tactical information. It is the silence of someone who has seen something that they have decided not to introduce into the consciousness of people who cannot handle it. There is a Harlequin expression that translates roughly as the mercy of ignorance. The idea that some knowledge is so heavy that sharing it is cruelty rather than generosity. The deep Webway has, apparently, sections that fall into this category. Sections whose specific properties the Harlequins consider so far outside the range of what mortal consciousness can accommodate that describing them would constitute an act of damage rather than an act of information. This is a remarkable claim from people who spend their lives performing the Dance Without End, an artistic work that recounts the fall of the Eldari in full emotional detail, that does not shy away from the horror of what the Eldari became and what that becoming cost them. What could be in the deep Webway that the Harlequins, who will dramatize the worst moment in their species' history for audiences who need to understand the weight of it, consider too much to describe? We don't know. The nature of the question makes it definitionally unanswerable through any investigation that produces a surviving investigator. The Harlequins know, presumably. Kegorach knows, certainly. The things that live in those sections presumably have no opinion on the matter. The rest of us have the mercy of ignorance, and the Harlequins have decided that is sufficient. Addendum 4. The Emperor's Hope, and why it was never recovered. We should dwell a little longer on what the Emperor's Webway project meant for humanity, because its failure is not just a logistical setback. It is a tragedy on a civilizational scale that echoes through everything that has happened to the Imperium in the 10,000 years since. The Emperor's plan was not, strictly speaking, to give humanity access to the Webway as a transit network and leave it there. That was the first step. The Webway was the tool by which he intended to pursue a much deeper goal, the evolution of humanity into a fully psychic species with a controlled and protected relationship to its psychic potential. In the 41st millennium, every human psyche is a potential catastrophe. The birth of a sufficiently powerful, uncontrolled psyche can tear open a gateway through which demons can pour. Entire worlds have been destroyed by psyche-triggered warp incursions. The Inquisition has dedicated enormous resources to identifying psyches, sanctioning the ones who can be made controllable and quietly disappearing the ones who cannot. Thousands of psyches a year are taken to terror as the tithe, the cost in human souls that keeps the Golden Throne functioning, sacrificed to maintain the Astronomicon that allows warp navigation. Every psyche who manifests is playing a dangerous game with the Imperium, and even the best trained ones are not safe. The Emperor's vision, as we understand it, was that this situation should not be permanent, that humanity's psychic development was inevitable. The species was heading toward becoming a fully psychic race over the long arc of its evolution. That the question was not whether this would happen, but whether it would happen in conditions where the development could be managed safely. The warp, as the environment through which humanity's psychic relationship to the universe currently operates, is chaos's territory. Humanity developing its psychic potential while entangled with the warp is chaos gaining purchase on every psyche born, every psychic act performed, every prayer and hope and fear that bleeds into the immaterium. The Webway was the solution to this. Remove humanity from the warp as its transit medium. Cut the primary entanglement. Allow the psychic evolution to proceed in a context where the immaterium's influence is not the only influence, where the development happens in conditions the Emperor could manage rather than in conditions chaos controlled. This is not the complete picture. There is evidence that the Emperor had plans beyond the Webway project for the longer-term development of human psychic potential, but the Webway was the foundation on which everything else rested. Without the Webway, the Emperor's plan was not delayed. It was ended. The failure of the Webway project meant the failure of the entire arc. The Imperium that would have emerged from the Emperor's vision was replaced by the Imperium that actually exists. A civilization where psykers are feared and regulated and sacrificed, where the primary method of interstellar travel requires navigating through the domain of entities that want to eat your soul, where the Emperor himself, the most powerful psychic entity in human history, is trapped on a dying golden machine, doing damage control on a wound that should never have been opened in the first place. The deep Webway contains, somewhere in its sealed and damaged sections, the remnants of the Emperor's constructed tunnels. The work of the Mechanicum unifiers, the new sections that were being built during the years of the Great Work, destroyed and sealed and lost in the war that followed Magnus's fateful choice. Whatever was being built there, whatever was being connected, whatever was being created, is gone now. Gone or sealed off, inaccessible, another section of the deep Webway, full of things that were once meant to help and have had 10,000 years to become something else. The Emperor sits on his throne, and whatever remains of his consciousness presses against the wound that Magnus made. And the wound that was meant to be a door to humanity's greatest achievement is the thing that has trapped him for 10,000 years. The irony is complete. The structure that was meant to free humanity from its dependence on the warp requires, for its containment, the most powerful human psychic mind in history to be perpetually occupied doing exactly the thing the Webway was supposed to render unnecessary. The deep Webway does not just contain the failures of the Aeldari. It contains the failure of humanity's one great chance to escape the cycle it is trapped in. The Old One's gift and the Emperor's dream, both broken in the same place, for related reasons, by the same fundamental principle that has governed galactic history since the War in Heaven, the terrible talent of powerful civilizations for damaging their greatest achievements. As Addendum 5, the practical guide that nobody uses because nobody survives, there is an ironic footnote to all of this, which is that there is more practical knowledge about navigating the deep Webway than you might expect given the extremely consistent outcome of attempts to do so. The problem is not that the knowledge doesn't exist. The problem is that possessing the knowledge does not reliably translate into surviving the application of it. The Aeldari have developed a substantial body of navigational practice around the Webway. The path system that Craftworld Aeldari use to organize their lives is partly about managing the specific mental requirements of Webway travel, the disciplines that maintain psychic coherence in an environment that erodes it, but the meditative techniques that allow Aeldari senses to pass the Webway's non-Euclidean geometry in ways that navigation can be built on. These techniques are genuinely effective in the maintained sections of the Webway. In the deep Webway, they provide meaningful advantage over no technique, but they are not sufficient to reliably survive. The Harlequins have additional techniques that go further. The Thailed, the Mask discipline, the specific relationship with Segarak that provides navigational intuition beyond what the Craftworld practices can give. Harlequins have survived in sections of the deep Webway that no Craftworld Aeldari would attempt. This is documented. It is not universal. Harlequins have died in the deep Webway too, and the Harlequin accounts of those losses are among the most carefully guarded texts in the Black Library. But it establishes that with sufficient knowledge and preparation, specific sections of the deep Webway can be traversed. For non-Aeldari, the advantage is much smaller. Imperial navigators who have entered Webway sections through unauthorized access, usually through undiscovered Webway gates, or through Webway-adjacent events, like chaos rituals that tear temporary access points, and have survived long enough to report on the experience consistently describe one thing above all others: the Webway's willingness to let you believe you're navigating successfully until you are not. The environment does not feel hostile in the way that the open warp feels hostile. There is no immediate sensation of spiritual danger. There is no obvious sign that the geometry is wrong until you've walked in a direction long enough to notice that you should have arrived somewhere by now. By the time the deep Webway reveals itself as what it is, the people inside it are generally too deep to exit quickly and too disoriented by the non-Euclidean geometry, the temporal uncertainties, and the early stages of psychic corrosion to make good decisions about which direction is out. The practical guide to surviving the deep Webway is therefore something like, don't enter without an invitation from a harlequin, and don't accept that invitation unless you are very certain that the harlequin is not playing a very long game with you for reasons you don't understand yet. These are not particularly practical instructions for most circumstances. The deeper, a more foundational instruction might be this. The deep Webway is not survivable in the way that dangerous environments are survivable. A battlefield is dangerous, but tactical intelligence and superior training and the right equipment can shift the odds substantially in a skilled warrior's favor. A void storm is dangerous, but a well-prepared ship with good navigation and proper void shielding can ride it out. The deep Webway does not yield to preparation in the same way, because the nature of its dangers is specifically calibrated against the things that preparation produces. You prepare by developing navigational skills. The non-Euclidean geometry defeats navigational skills by ensuring that the skills were developed for a kind of space that doesn't exist in there. You prepare by being psychically capable. The Psychnuins specifically target psychic capability and use it as a targeting system. You prepare by bringing heavily armed support. The entities in the deep Webway have adapted to an environment where heavily armed support does not change the fundamental geometry of the situation.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.